So here we're in we can say a distant neighborhood, as it is very. There are no streets that allow this passage. Here is a cemetery, and so the famous picture of Paraisópolis is taken here. And we have many different interfaces in the favela. Here, it's the main street of the broader neighborhood. And here we have discrete connections between the formal neighborhood and the favela. So here we don't see Paraisópolis when we ride a car or walk down here. And in some ways, the public interventions they try to recreate a new facade, a new front to hide the favela. So when they intervene, and we'll see that a bit later, there's this intention that's readable also that we can explain through land disponibility, but also through this very real effect of hiding the informal neighborhood and opening new formal land opportunities for private investors. So here we have this, and we can see two paces, two scales of investment in the favelas, both formal and informal. So there's the intense core of the favela where there is these large scale businesses and small scale stalls that occupy the sidewalk, and with this dense and thick urban fabric, there is a very real issue with the core presence. So there's a great commercial value, real estate value in parking lots and central parking lots, and we have the ordinary fabric of the favela with small scale constructions, and each inhabitant adapts to the slope and appropriates differently the front, this frontage, and here we have the more incremental fabric that operates in different rhythms and with a different urban thickness. So this sidewalk appropriation tells us the importance of the Rez de Ville for social interaction and urban life in this context, as there is very little open space in this urban fabric. So these fronts are often very densely populated, not only for customers, but also for the inhabitants of the core of the blocks. And we have different strategies to appropriate the sidewalk. So when the large stores, they create a void in front of the to accommodate customers, but the smaller stores, they occupy literally the sidewalk and take every opportunity to occupy these spaces. So there's a very different thickness of these stores that open to the Rez de Ville, and these openings can be as narrow as 1 meter, and there is an addition process and we can create and take back these spaces in function of family and biographical evolutions. So this creates an urban thickness with a front of a commercial front and a residential back alleys and rental housing behind. So this, sorry for the transparency, but all this has been conducted with commented domestic percourses with inhabitants and informal landlords that with a mapping of domestic itineraries and practices of everyday life that help to understand this the core of the favela as an inhabited construction site where a permanent this permanent construction site coexists with everyday life. Sorry for the colors. So there's a recomposition, a great diversity, typological diversity that tells us that we have different paces of investment, and we can think of a stratigraphic dimension of incrementality that tells us a story. And with the surveys, with the interviews, we saw that every change in materiality tells an interaction story. Here, it began as a window, and through negotiations with the neighbor, the self-builder started building a first wall, a second wall, and through negotiation, as the neighbor didn't want this proximity, it closed itself and formed this this thickness. So this incrementality is an incrementality, an addition of urban networks. It's an addition, as we saw, of formal and informal commerce. It's also something that is to be understood as with a vibrant urban life, and there are block parties that bring people from all around the city, but also all around the state of São Paulo. So tens of thousands of people come to this particular favela for these block parties, these weekly block parties that change the orientation of retail stores that dedicates themselves to this cultural life in the core of the favela where the parties happen. And outside in the peripheries of the favela, we have another kind of appropriation of sidewalks with storage and extensions of and gardening and extensions of the buildings. There's a great importance of parking spaces also, and so we have parkings that can be rented as for parties, for receptions, for community gatherings, and also an addition of inhabited places, an extension of houses over public spaces, and cantilevered room extensions over alleyways, and a recomposition of urban porosity with the addition of stairs that indicate the vertical extensions and the construction of rental accommodations upstairs, but also the closing of alleyways for against passage. I try to conclude. So we have a great difference between in domestic porosities or public porosities and the appropriation opportunities that offers. These the rental spaces have a very narrowing and thickening of public percourse, and the openings are often are always on the terraces of the house that are dedicated to leisure, to collective uses, and construction, storage, and future extension. And the openings are depend on land control, and these openings depend on this kind of openings depend on land informal property, informal tenure of the spaces, and there's a real difficulty in maintaining open spaces inside the favela, as this idea of urban space confronts itself with the necessity of housing, and this centrality that the neighborhood offers. So there's a constant reclaiming of open space, and a new and the public interventions, when they create these openings, they are faced with this pressure over the open land, and also the creation of new urban facades and new polarities that create also opportunities for informal uses and commerce, and we see here the new wall that hides the informal neighborhood, and the alternative, the informal alternative that creates this open Rez de Ville on this avenue. So to conclude, this new urban interfaces created by urban interventions, these large scale additions that create that hide the informal neighborhood, they tend to help us understand informality as an introverted urbanization process but that creates a thick that has an urban thickness that offers also a vibrant urban life.
Take a couple of questions. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. My question, maybe you don't know, but the new houses that they're hiding the slums. Who are the people who go there? Like, who are? Is the government decided who is moved into there, or can anyone come by? My question is because in Buenos Aires we are making like a similar process of urbanization in some village, in some slums. And for example, we took the empty space that we left on the slum to create new public spaces for the slum. So I wanted to know if you know how the process is going on, and how they decide.
This is a very important question, because in 2006 they made the first survey to quantify how much houses they should build. So they quantified it. They needed like 2,000 new houses. So between 2006 and the beginning of this project, the favela population had already been up, and so the first part of this housing has been finished by 2014, and but the informal areas had already grown much more than the initial quantification of the need. So there's a snowball effect and that I think it can be explained by this peripheral centrality idea that there is an attractivity to consolidated settlement. So there's a constant process of informal growth that and the public policies need to step up in a sense and not consider it as something that should not exist or should be stopped because it defies this definition.
Thank you for the presentation. You just, I mean, I guess it's a continuation of what was asked before. I mean, there has been several waves of policies related to how spontaneous development. I don't think we use formal anymore. I think we can have a debate over that, but there's been attempts to kind of register ownership and basically not necessarily go in that direction, meaning just replace and build new things, but you actually give tenure, official tenure, you give better infrastructures. I mean, basically the government acknowledge that these places have the right to exist. Of course, the latest governments in Brazil have not been very helpful in this direction. I was wondering how much is your work, let's say, helpful is maybe exaggerated, but like can be potentially something that would help give access to these areas. I mean, in a way, what Andres was talking about with the work on pedestrians as a way to give a seat to the table. How much is this work that you're doing, potentially doing that for that area?
So this work sheds light on something that's very difficult to understand from the point of view of policymakers. That's this snowball effect. So there's a rental help that has been given on the beginning of this process to expel the inhabitants. This is just an example of the stakes. This help of it's a small help to pay for rental accommodation in the meantime during the span of the construction of the housing project, and there is a bloating of this demand of rental demand, and that the policymakers can't understand, and there is an inexplicable gap between the first surveys and the dynamics that are at play in the production of self-built housing, and what this kind of research shed light on is the but not much what I've showed here, but it's the diversity of real estate inventors' profiles, and the apparition of a new scale of informal investors and or informal. It's an imperfect term, but it speaks about the relationship with formalization processes and the relationship with the state. So that's I mean the boundaries where it's useful, but it hides other aspects. So this informal petty capitalists, investors that are linked to other illegal markets in this favela plays a crucial role in leveraging access to land, access to informal land, and through this typologic look at informal or precarious building production, we can localize and identify the scale of this this new scale of investment, and that sheds a light on the differences in rental prices, and how political negotiation happens, and the network of actors inside the favela.
Thank you.